For those of you who are familiar with some of the work that we've been doing, you know that we typically focus on the business of media. Today, we're going to talk about that, but we've got kind of something special lined up that's a little different from our normal fare. We're going to get into really the role of journalism in, trying times like this and how important it is to have an active, vibrant, healthy media. And I'm pleased in that regard to welcome Essie Cupp, the host of CNN's Essie Cupp Unfiltered, which is a weekly Saturday program covering the white-hot intersection of politics and media. And she's a political commentator. In addition to Essie's work at CNN, she's a nationally syndicated columnist for the New York Daily News. And formerly, she was the co-host of NBC's The Cycle and CNN's Crossfire. She's written for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, among others. And she regularly appears on Real Time with Bill Maher, which is a show that I love and actually living in LA have had the chance to see in person. Cupp was a consultant also for HBO's hit series The Newsroom and contributing editor for Town Hall magazine. She's currently on the board of the Cornell University Institute of Politics, and hopefully one day she'll be on our board. You will find that she pulls no punches. Talk a little bit about what you're doing right now.
So my weekly show, it's a Saturday show, it's live, has, as of late, been preempted by the president's press briefing. It happens right in my hour. So what we've done is we've taken Unfiltered, and I'm doing Unfiltered from home. And it's a condensed show. Instead of a full hour, I'm basically doing a segment. Sometimes that's an interview. I recently interviewed Tom Nichols. I interviewed Congressman Eric Swalwell out your neck of the woods. Sometimes it's a monologue. Sometimes I'm chatting with some panelists. So I'm trying to pick what I think is sort of the most topical story, since I only have a limited amount of time to do it, that is still going to engage viewers. Because what I like to do on my show is provoke some thought about something you think you might know about, something you've been hearing a lot about in the news, but maybe we can ask some different questions about it, or we can approach it a different way, or we can reframe it, or bring in different voices that you might not have expected. So that's what I'm trying to do every week. I've got the weekly column also in the New York Daily News to do opinion journalism. There's a lot of passion, fear, anxiety. It's a tough time, and people want to hear quote unquote real talk. And it's also a very hard time to do what I do because it's precarious. I take what I do very seriously. It's a huge responsibility. And so, not that I'm not always careful, but I'm particularly careful when there's so many facts and information, just raw information is so important, and it's being politicized and it's being weaponized. So it's rewarding to have the privilege to do what I'm doing right now, to still have a platform, to still have a job, to still have a place to funnel, my energy, my curiosity. But it's also challenging. It's very challenging to do what we're doing at this time, not just logistically from my house, but also just, the pragmatic aspects of covering a story like this.
Well, that's the thing. I can imagine you just cited a very specific logistical challenge, which is how do you even prepare to do a show when there are going to be press conferences and other things that cut away from your show on a regular basis? I'm sure that there are a ton of other challenges just even producing a show remotely at this point. How do you manage that?
It's week to week, Jay. We've tried me shooting my part, another person, the person I'm interviewing shooting their part, merging them together. We've tried doing a show on Zoom. We have tried some other software. We're playing with it every week to get it so that it's in the best technological format, also the easiest, so I can actually dialogue with people in real time and it's not clunky, it's user friendly. We're all experimenting right now. None of us have this down. And so, we're trying new things every week, but it is challenging with a producer at her house. I have bosses, right? I have to run stories through my bosses and
Right.
run guests through my bosses. They're at their houses, and the people I feed this stuff to when I'm done to capture it and then put it up are in makeshift control rooms, and it's a lot of effort to put this together. And I mean, for me, it's worth it. I hope it's worth it for folks, out there. But we're working hard to get this stuff out. We're used to it being a lot easier. So you can take all of the people and the logistics and the resources for granted until you realize how many moving parts there really are.
Well, and then, I can imagine that the access piece is an issue as well. So you're sitting here trying to make sure that the conversation that you're having actually reflects reality, and some of the people whose voices ought to be kind of elevated and showcased, trying to reach them when you don't actually have a central place to do business anymore and all sorts of stuff. That's got to be tricky too.
Exactly. And part of the real currency in my business is access. And that's access to guests who have access to the story that you're covering. I'm in a newsroom usually. Our reporters are out in the field. We've got anchors at the White House, So having access to people who know stuff is a huge part of my business. When I'm talking to an expert who hasn't been able to leave the house, right? That kind of limits the experiential conversation that you have. That expert is still an expert and can still weigh in, but they're one step removed. And that's been particularly hard for our reporters covering the ins and outs of the pandemic from hospitals, where there has been incredibly limited access. And that's for good reasons, I understand. Two of them, really. One is protecting us from getting sick, and the other is protecting the hospital, right? You're going to see some bad stuff that might not look great for hospitals, and opening up a hospital to scrutiny during a crisis is probably a lot more than they want to manage. But, I've been saying, look, journalists are embedded in war zones.
Right.
We know, I've been overseas. I've covered terrorism in hot spots. We put ourselves on the line as a job. So let us take care of ourselves. We can. And to the other concern, sunlight truly is the best disinfectant, literally in our case of journalism. So we need to see what's happening. And if that is to the benefit of doctors and first responders and nurses, terrific. If it exposes some weaknesses, I think that's a benefit as well, as painful as that might be. It's hard to tell these stories without having access. It's hard to convince people that this is more serious than they may think, or not to freak out as much as they might be doing. It's hard to do that when we have limited access.
Well, so it's funny because this is the crux of what I want to talk about. So we've got the economic issues, the issues around access, and the way we've modeled news coverage, right, in a way, in the modern era, right? So in the past, a lot more resource was dedicated to investigative journalism. Folks would go out and find the story on their own. But now we depend a lot, particularly with the speed that information passes back and forth, on experts who, can tell us what's going on. And it's your job to kind of weave the facts that we can find, the access to those experts, et cetera, together into a story that reflects reality. And so when you talk about this difficulty around folks wanting to or not wanting to make themselves available, there are real downstream repercussions to that, not just with respect to can we pull together a story by Friday. It's also, has implications in terms of what the cultural mindset is, how people respond to the crisis, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of it in terms of how you approach your role?
Well, look, this is not a new phenomenon. A lot of what's happening right now is new, but this isn't. A classic example for journalists is, do we show, the caskets coming home from war? do we show some of the frontline,
The
collateral
horrors.
damage of war? Yeah, of war. And that's a debate. That is not settled science in journalism, right? I happen to think the answer should be always yes. But there are real concerns with doing that, both for our men and women fighting overseas for lots of reasons. And so we are constantly examining as journalists, what is our role in the context of this story? And we have different roles, right? Reporters have a role and anchors have a role. I'm an opinion journalist. I still use journalism to inform my opinions. We all have different roles. Sometimes that can feel like advocacy, especially during a health crisis, right? I mean, we're giving out advice
Mm.
all the time. Advice about, well, where to check out your local food bank, where to go to get tested, whether or not to get tested, whether or not to go outside. I mean, we're giving advice that can feel like advocacy sometimes. And on the other, it can feel like real activism, when we're put in a position as journalists to side with ex-politician versus ex-expert. That can feel like activism, even though it's journalism. This is what we do. Navigating that is tricky. We want people to trust us and to us. And when they come in with their sort of set of self-affirmations and politics and bias, all that stuff that we all carry around, whether we admit it or not, that's a barrier, for journalism that we have to get through. We have to get through it every day.
How do you approach that? How much of what you talk about is really kind of journalistic reporting? How much of that is opinion? How do you kind of stay true to your own core values?
Yeah. Look, I'm an opinion journalist. I don't speak for all of us, right? I have different standards than some might, but I use reporting. I use journalism to do my opinion, right? Whether that's in print or online or broadcast. So I double source stories. I make calls. I try to talk to people who know what's going on, because I'm not on the ground everywhere. And most importantly, I try to leave the newsroom as often as I can. And obviously right now that's difficult, but two of my favorite, all-time favorite columnists from the New York Daily News, were never in the office. You never saw them, right? Back in the 70s,
Mm.
these guys were running around New York City, getting the stories, finding the stories. And then they'd splash a great column out that was full of rich opinion and full of descriptors. It was based in, where they had been and what they had seen. And that's so important, I think, for journalists today, meaning in this era, to get outside of the newsroom and meet real people and go into real communities. Again, that's hard to do right now, but just in general, that's something I think we all have to keep in mind. And so I'm informing my opinion the way I would any story. But as I said earlier, I take this very seriously. When I get out and say something publicly, I really want it to be true. I want it to be as true as
Right.
it can possibly be. And again, that's also hard. But we do the best we can. Sometimes we get it wrong. It's important when we do to say so, to acknowledge that, to create that trust with viewers and readers. But the combining facts and reporting with opinion is a puzzle I put together every day. It's a puzzle of a little of this and a little of that and a little of this, and it comes together, and I feel like the puzzle's done, then I can present it. I don't like to do it on the fly as I go.
Right. And it's funny, you say a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You've done quite a bit in your career that's kind of brought you to this point where you could do this. Can you talk and just share with the folks who are on this session, talk a little bit about some of your experiences and how they've kind of prepared you for what you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah, I've worked everywhere. I've worked at newspapers, magazines, online, radio, television, and I worked at big papers, small papers. I've been a lot of places, and that has helped inform not just the way I want to do opinion journalism, but the way other people are doing it too. And the differences in best practices that I've taken from radio, from television, from print, from online, I think make me a more complete journalist. Television news, as you know, is a very specific thing.
Right.
It's very different from radio. It's very different from print. So I love that I've had experiences in all of those, and I continue to. I hope I always get to sort of dabble in all of that, because I think it sharpens a lot of different muscles that can get dull otherwise if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. But also, I'll say, having worked in both at liberal publications and news outlets, and Republicans, conservative news outlets, and in between, pop culture talk, that helps too. Because if you're just speaking in an echo chamber, look, I used to go on Fox a lot as a Republican back when I was aligned with them, and that felt good. It felt real good to speak in an echo chamber, right? And have everyone say, no matter what you said, "You're so right, Essie, good point." That feels good. But I left there for MSNBC, where I was, the token conservative at the time. And that made me such a better pundit and such a better commentator, to really strengthen my arguments and not rely on my colleagues to just say, "You're so right. You're so right." And then coming to CNN, which is in the middle,
in between, right?
yeah. Well, I like listening. I like doing TV with Van Jones. We don't agree on a lot, but it's great when we find that thing that we both agree on. That's awesome. We love reaching that middle ground together, and I think that's why we like doing TV together. But I can hear from Trump voters and speak that language just as well as I can talk to David Axelrod and speak Obama land, and I think that's it's important to me. It makes me constantly have to challenge what I think I know and my inner biases. So I've enjoyed sort of experiencing the political panoply of media environments as well. It means I can go on Bill Maher and I'm not, I'm always a little nervous, but I'm not like scared out of my mind, to go up against Bill Maher, liberal audience, other liberal guests. That's a hard show to do, but I love it.
Life comes at you quick on Bill Maher. Yeah.
Sure does, but I love it. And I think people, if they know me at all, they know I'm not your typical, in a box conservative. I like agreeing with liberals when they're right, and I find they are a lot. And so I can only do that because I've, experienced and listened to my friends across the aisle for years. And, I think that's important for all of us to do.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I'm thinking about kind of traditional journalistic standards versus this environment that we're in now, where news is a business, one, and where social media and the speed of digital media. So, the idea that there's breaking news and it hits people's phones before you can get to a TV show, a publication, et cetera. How those things have really put the squeeze on traditional journalistic practices. Has that impacted you? Obviously, when you're talking about opinion, journalistic based opinion, you don't have necessarily the requirement to always do things the way you would traditionally do them. But still, I have to imagine that impacts you too.
Yeah, I mean, there have been times where I'm on a live show and I have to break news, whether it's, an awful tragedy or a natural disaster. And I literally am the first person telling you a story. That's rare, though. I have to assume every time I go on television or I set out to write a column, someone's already heard the story and they've got an opinion about it. And so my job is to bring a different opinion, or make you challenge your opinion or strengthen your opinion because you've already made up your mind. In this environment, that's how you have to think, which is challenging because I tend to break things down more slowly. I would like to present all the facts. I would like time to lay it out. Then let's have a discussion. And then on the end, let's form an opinion. My business works the opposite. Straight out with your opinion, then break it down. And maybe in there somewhere you give all the facts. That's challenging for me to move at the speed of, broadcast television as an opinion host. But people get used to watching the news in a certain way, and especially someone who's giving them opinion, they want it right away and then tell me why. That's challenging for me. I go along with it, but because I want to keep I want to keep viewers, but it's challenging. I wish I could give facts first and then say, you make up your mind, then let's talk. But that's not how this all works.
Well, part of it is the culture, right? Right now, we are living in a time where even some of our elected officials don't lead with facts.
Yep.
And so that's naturally going to change what people expect when they go and consume their news.
That's very tricky. The politicization, obviously not just of news, but of like health information, of facts, of
Right.
science, is so frustrating. This demonization of experts, which I've watched mostly from the right for more than a decade. I've watched that sort of erode, and it's super frustrating. There is nothing wrong with expertise. It's not elitist. It's not establishment. People are experts in things for a reason, and we should listen to experts instead of weaponizing and demonizing what they're saying. And I watched, my friends at Fox the other night demonizing Tony Fauci, who's, by the way, a Trump appointee.
Right.
Without saying why they think he's wrong, without saying, here's the science I have an issue with. Just don't believe him. Well, to me, that's quackery. That's the definition of fake science, of false prophets, of quackery. And it's really frustrating. It's really frustrating because we can have opinions, right? You can have the opinion that you prefer not to trust what so-and-so is saying, but to discredit an expert just because he's an expert and the so-called expert class is aligned with, in your mind, some political agenda is bananas to me. And it's so hard for us to cut through that. It's almost impossible. I try every day and it's impossible to cut through that. If someone has decided experts are the enemy, nothing you say is going to change their mind.
Well, that's the difference, right, between thinking and believing, right? So beliefs are harder to change, obviously. They come from a different part of the brain. And, it's funny, what you're describing, I would typically ascribe to fandom. So when we typically talk about the business of entertainment, and we talk about all the different genres, you think about music, sports, some of these celebrities, there's a way that you cultivate a following and people just kind of root for you. And even when you do things that are inappropriate or wrong, they're still so connected to you that they stand you up. And in fact, sometimes there's this reaction where they feel like they're in on the joke, so that whatever harm you may have caused or whatever offense you have caused, that's amusing to them because it's offensive to those other people, right?
Yes.
It becomes dangerous when you take that kind of fandom approach and bring it into journalism and news.
And a pandemic. I mean, it's literally the most dangerous time, right? To be picking sides and putting people on sides. It's infuriating, frankly. It gets me really worked up, right? Because I'm yelled at all the time from people online and stuff, that
I'm
I
yelled
have
at
a
all the time too.
job.
That's usually from inside my house, but that's a different.
Well, I can take it from inside the house, but when it's 1,000 people on Twitter, um, yelling at me because I have a job and therefore I shouldn't have a say. And I'm grateful I have a job, but that should not exclude me from a conversation about keeping my family healthy. And that doesn't preclude me from having compassion for people who don't have jobs and thinking about them and not wanting them to get sick. But it's just become so vicious. And, the word tribal gets thrown around a lot when we talk about politics and news. And it just feels like the absolute worst time for that kind of stuff. And yet, here we are.
Right. Now, we talked a little bit about kind of some of the landscape that you're working in, which obviously creates its own constraints. But what in a perfect world would we be doing as we talk about what's going on in this particular crisis and what should be happening? Like what should people be focused on? How should we be talking about these issues? How do we leverage our news assets? Like what should be happening?
Well, I got to be honest with you, and this is probably not, what my myriad bosses want me to say, but I think at times like these, local news is so much more helpful, impactful, influential than, national news.
Why?
It's important to tune in to the president's press briefing if you want to hear what the president has to say and listen to his experts. But what's going on with food shortages in your city? Is the water supply tainted in your city? Work stoppages, restaurant openings, all the things, hospital cases, all the things that matter to you are happening at a local level. And the national story is important for context for all of us. I mean, we're a country, we're all United States, but local news is really, I think, where your best bang for your buck is going to come right now. Unfortunately, that comes at a collision point where local news is incredibly underfunded, under-resourced, is dying out altogether in many places, just shuttering local papers and local TV stations, or they're getting sort of consumed by bigger networks.
Mm-hmm.
That's really, really scary because some of the most important stories of our lives have been broken at the local level. If you think about Flint, Michigan, if you think about Penn State, more recently, the Jeffrey Epstein story, that was a Florida story. Access to news and information by race, by class. The socioeconomic playing field is not level in that way. And there's a million reasons for that, from gerrymandering to
redlining, all of that.
All of it, yes. But one important thing is local news. And, I was looking at the Brunswick News is the local paper in Georgia where the Ahmaud Arbery case happened. Mm-hmm. The Brunswick News had, as of today, I went on just before we started talking, 76 stories about Ahmaud Arbery since February 23rd when he was killed. That's a lot for a local paper. And that includes AP Wire stories that they carried, but also letters to the editor, right? Reaction from their community. So that local paper was obviously on this story well before the national news decided it was important.
Right. That's,
I think, where communities are best informed. And so I was telling, Tom Steyer and every other billionaire who would come on my show who was running for president, quit this campaign, go buy local newspapers, go start local TV stations. because that's where you're really going to shake up politics. That's where you're really going to inform people about a health crisis in their backyard. We all play our part. And I think CNN actually does a great job reporting local stories, but we can't be in every town.
Right.
So I wish there were more investment in local news, and I think that would do a lot to level the playing field when it comes to access to information.
And one of the things that's big with that is talent. That is to say, a lot of this is driven by human beings who go out and get the story. And when these, organizations are underfunded, they just literally can't hire the people to do it, right? They
That's
can't
exactly
get there.
right. I mean, you can go to an extreme example, right? Like a war zone, places like Syria where reporters are not allowed. That is
Right.
a very hard story to report. There we rely on aid groups and not for profit organizations to give us information. That's an extreme case where not every journalism outfit can afford to hire, war reporters to go overseas. Those are expensive posts. But on a much less extreme level, hiring a person to cover your local school board, to cover
Right.
your local sanitation board. I mean, those are important stories to every family. You can't do that if you don't have the money. One of the most important things that I think we've lost in journalism is the religion beat. I myself, I'm not religious. I'm an atheist, but I have a master's in religion. I like religion. I study religion. I think religion is good ultimately. And this country is religious. It's a religious majority country. And yet newspaper after newspaper has lost their religion beat. And I think that's really missing a wide swath of people and concerns and interests. And we're not telling an entire side of American culture by missing that. And, name your beat. They're all getting pared down. We all suffer from that.
Right. And in this kind of increasingly digital society, what's interesting is that what kind of bubbles up through journalism ends up being deployed across the media ecosystem, right? So when you kind of choke the front end of the funnel, that means that there's less variety, diversity of opinion, et cetera, that reaches folks in the national news outlets, the digital news outlets, because they're relying on that stuff, as source material for the work that they do.
Exactly. It allows us to live in our bubbles and our echo chambers. When we don't have those local stories, we sort of spin our wheels, and those stories are out there. They're not happening. I think it's important for people in LA to hear about stories from people in Manhattan, Kansas, that is, not, Manhattan, New York. And I think it's important for people in Manhattan, Kansas to hear from people in LA and what's going on there. That's going to make us all better neighbors and a better community. That's going to help ease some of the divisiveness. We can't do that. We can't do that when we don't have local news.
Yeah, I love it. Now, I've been monopolizing your time. Folks, if you're on this session, you're welcome to ask questions of your own. If you scroll your mouse down to the bottom, you'll see that there's a button for chatting. If you pop that open, you're more than welcome to type out questions, and I'll pass them along. So as we kind of hit the second half of this conversation, I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, et cetera, so that we can incorporate those into this chat, all right? So, I want you to talk a little bit about the fog of war. Essentially, we've used the war as an example, but I want to use it here as an analogy. In the current crisis, one of the biggest challenges is that, we're getting information in drips and drops. We don't have the big picture, so we don't even know how to contextualize some of that information, right? And that lack of a complete picture can be weaponized.
Yes.
Right?
So true. I remember maybe even a couple months ago, a friend of mine, another journalist, said something on Twitter like, to be fair, none of us really could have predicted how bad this was going to be. It was a defense of the White House not really figuring this out until much, much later into the pandemic. And I thought, yes, true. None of us predicted it would go here, but that's not the requirement of journalists. It's not the requirement to be clairvoyant. Our requirement is to know what we don't know and be responsible about that. And so I think that little tweak is kind of a helpful reminder for all of us. I think about it all the time. There's stuff I don't know, and I need to know what it is I don't know. And you don't have to fill in that blank with misinformation or conjecture. You can wait until you know to go that far. Now, at the same time, we also have the responsibility to piece things together and say, based on all the information we have from all these various experts and all of these sources, we feel pretty certain this is going to get worse. That's important to say and piece together. And again, we're not in the fortune telling business, but it's important to use all the tools we have and give the best, most analysis that we have. Sometimes, hopefully very rarely, it will be wrong, and we will have to revisit that. We're not perfect, but hopefully most of the time it will be helpful, and it will be based on sound information and data.
So on that point, one of the things we talked about earlier was access. And it occurs to me that we have people who are repeatedly wrong and still repeatedly find themselves in media outlets sharing their opinions, whether that, the fact that their stuff is not factually accurate has to do with their lack of information, or if it has to do with their own agenda. But nevertheless, we see people who get it wrong over and over and over again on the same topic, kind of being brought back to share the misinformation again and again and again. What generates that kind of a cycle, and how do we break it?
It is the fundamental question. And I'm sure you've seen, the media wrestling with this. Fact checking, do we fact check the president in real time, for example? Do we take his press briefings live, or do we take a chunk and so that we can present facts? And, that's something that the media is wrestling with, not just because of Trump, but because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists out there and who have large platforms in some cases. And how do we report on those kinds of stories without feeding into them? I mean, it's a real challenge for the media. A friend of mine at the New York Times named Farhad Manju lives in Palo Alto, and he covers this sort of thing. And he wrote a book called True Enough almost a decade ago. I mean, this was not like a Trump book. This was before Trump, where things in news have become true enough. It's true enough to make it to air. And that's not across the board, but it's become a phenomenon, and it's super, super dangerous. I think Colbert had something called truthiness.
Truthiness, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So this problem has been, I think, evolving for years with the the rise of the internet and social media and the quickness that information can spread. It's just, we don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. I think you and I talked earlier about, if you look at the way things that you put in your body are regulated, right? The FDA says, well, certain things are drugs. Certain things are medicine. Certain things are just vitamins. And certain things are kind of like hocus pocus. And so then you get to choose. I am not suggesting we have a regulated media, but it would be nice to know, that certain news personalities or writers or pundits came with a label, right? What you are watching is entertainment, or what you are watching is opinion journalism, or what you are watching is straight reporting. I do not begrudge news consumers for not being able to figure out what is what. It's The lines are very, very blurry.
Yeah, yeah, and we do need to figure out some ways to help them in terms of the consumption and the analysis of the stuff that's available, right? I don't know if it means that we have a truthiness index, but I like your idea of potentially kind of categorizing some of these outlets based on style.
What they are. And
Punditry,
look, there's
right?
room for everybody. I mean,
Yep.
I'm not for censorship. I'm not for taking people down or off the air. But to know what it is you're watching, I think, including for my work, to know
Yeah.
what you are watching when you watch me, I just think I think it's important clarity that we're not really getting.
So this dovetails with one of the questions from our participants, which
Great.
has to do with kind of the tendency of some outlets to criticize only certain politicians, right? And how
Sure.
that impacts that audience, but also folks who might be critical of that platform.
Yeah, that happens all the time. Also not new. It happens on both sides.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's super dangerous. It's why there's an erosion of trust between news consumers and the media, because that hypocrisy or those double standards in the long run benefit no one. They might in the short term benefit your guy, but in the long run no one benefits from protecting politicians on quote unquote your side. One of the things that I found most liberating as I came up through journalism was this idea that it is not our jobs to be liked. It most certainly
Right.
isn't our jobs to be liked by people in positions of power. And it really isn't our jobs to be liked by like the president or the Senate,
Right.
um, on either side. That's really not our job. And when you stop caring about that, like I said, it's very liberating. And so I can call out the president, and I can also call out, ex-Democratic politician, Hillary Clinton or, Chuck Schumer, whatever. I can call them out equally, because even though I come with a conservative background, I don't care who likes me. I am not in this to be liked by people in power. That's the exact opposite of why I'm in this. So it means maybe a fewer Christmas cards, fewer cocktail party invites. But that's never really been interesting currency to me. Now, if it is, then yeah, there are places you can go for that kind of commentary where political friends are protected and everyone's on the same team, playing at the same game and on the same side. Journalists and politicians working together. To me, that's not journalism. That's the opposite of journalism.
It's PR.
There's, it's PR. Exactly right. It's propaganda.
Yeah. 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 So another question has
Oh,
to
hey,
do with,
Kiana. I see my friend Kiana Fulton's on there.
hey, Kiana.
She's great.
We've got a question about the increasing negativity in the news. And I know that over the years, we've had reports of people where parents are not letting the kids watch the news because they think it's scary or too violent or too negative. The question is really, how do we bring balance back to, and kind of include good news? But I'd ask it a little bit differently, which is to say, if the news is reflecting reality, is there a burden to have a balance in the news, right? So
Right.
in the current situation that we find ourselves in with respect to the virus, I can imagine that plus what's going on with oil globally, North Korea, Iran, you name it, that, it's kind of, you have a stack of things that are not going to make people happy. I don't,
Right.
my question to you is, in those situations, in those moments in history when things are kind of going off the rails, is it the obligation of our news platforms to even have that kind of a balance?
I don't think that's our responsibility to balance readers and viewers' emotional, you know, experience with the news. Everybody has the right to turn off the TV, walk away from the computer, get off Twitter, whatever. Um, But I'll also say, as a business, ours is also a business of supply and demand. If y'all wanted C-SPAN, we'd do C-SPAN, okay?
That's true.
But,
If you want a
we're
PBS NewsHour, that's what it
that's
would
what we
be.
do. We do it all damn day, right? 24 hours of PBS NewsHour. That's not what at least cable news viewers demand. Now, I'll remind you, pick the top performing cable news show. I think it's Hannity still. Hannity's getting huge numbers, right? But like 1% of the American television viewing population. So he does great. Fox does great in prime time. They get big numbers, but it doesn't mean everybody in the country's watching. It's a very small fraction of people that are watching cable news. And, relatively the same for all three networks. So people do have an appetite for something else and they are watching it. And it's, Netflix and sports and stuff that's not the news. But if y'all wanted your news done differently, we'd respond. Believe me, we're very good at picking up on what viewers like and don't like. So part of the onus is on consumers. If you want us to be different, demand it. Until that happens, I think cable news is going to respond to viewers' demands.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the viewer, all this from the viewer's perspective, what would you recommend a viewer do to try to kind of fact check friends and family who are spreading misinformation that they got from, pick your source? Like, am I supposed to sit in front of the television all day long so that I know about all the conspiracy theories, so that I know how to debunk? Like, how do you even manage that?
It's tough. It's tough in my own family and friend group. There's a joke I like to tell that, over the past few years, I've become very disenchanted with the Republican Party and a lot of my friends on the right. And, I get emails and texts and letters all the time. You've changed. What happened to you? You used to be such a great conservative. And I have to be like, Dad, I'm still the same.
Right.
It's in my own family, and we're talking recently. He does not agree with some of the experts and what they're suggesting. And I said, well, if you'd like to see your grandson anytime soon, you will respect you will respect what the experts are telling you, not what Sean Hannity is telling you. And listen, I say that Sean's a friend. I say this with no personal animosity here, other than to say there are experts and there are clearly not experts. And so it's tough. I mean, it was tough before this pandemic. It's tougher now. It's tougher now because the stakes are higher.
So I've seen, the two kind of extreme examples of this that I've seen recently. One is Michael Flynn, where I see people dancing in the streets at the idea that he would be, that the charges would be dropped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when, according to all the reporting leading up to this moment, not only does all the overwhelming evidence show that he lied to government officials, but that he himself admitted to it and pleaded that way and so forth. So, that's one. And the other has to do with this issue around the moving goalposts around the impact of the virus. At one point we were saying, oh, there's only gonna be 5 cases, maybe 15, it'll go away. Now we're at, say, 70,000 deaths, and expecting that number is gonna explode over the summer. And folks are making the argument that it's great if we can keep the deaths to 200,000 people or 100,000, right? So in those two examples, we see these narratives that spring up, I don't know from where, and trying to imagine a consumer having a conversation with people in their own social network about kind of what the experts say, what the facts show, et cetera, has to be like playing whack-a-mole. What do you do? I mean, what do you do when you prepare for your show? What do you do to make sure that you're prepared for things that people might say in the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. My show, by design, is a little different than some others. I don't have people on just to yell at them or to embarrass them, or to gotcha.
Hmm.
Other people can, and some people really like watching that. It's just not interesting to me. So when I have people on, it's because I already have an idea that their opinion is important, it's informed, and even if it differs than mine, it's something I want people to hear about. So I, try to avoid having the crazy happen on my show. It's not fun for me. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. It's not satisfying. It's not why I started doing this. But just in sort of general, interacting with people, friends, colleagues. I mean, I've got colleagues at Fox and we talk and we have different facts, right? We come from different facts and which blows my mind. But it's important that I talk to them about that. I want to know where their heads are at because then I know where my dad's thinking. And a lot of people that I know. So it might feel good to sort of just, well, I'm going to turn that off, pretend they don't exist. All those people that don't agree with me. But that's a fool's errand because they do and they vote. And so whatever side you're on, you better know what they're thinking and what they want. Because if you don't, that's how you get someone elected that you didn't want elected and you never thought could get elected.
Right. Now it seems like there's a double standard. This is another question, where journalists seem to be held to a higher standard for truth telling than elected officials.
You're telling me.
So, how do you wrestle with that?
Look, we should be held to the highest standards as journalists. But yes, the same people complaining about what someone says on CNN is going to defend the president of the United States who lies perpetually, who is wrong constantly, to the death. Will defend him to the death. And you can see it on I'm not both sidesing this because it's specific to Trump, but I can see it too from some on the left who will defend, again, I'll use the example of Hillary just because she's, a large figure who's divisive, to the death too. And that's not helpful. And it doesn't give the person critiquing the media any credibility if they're not going to also apply it to their favorite, political elected officials. So I don't think the bar for journalists should be lowered, certainly, but of course it should be raised for elected officials. Of course it should be raised for the president. But there's only so much we can do, besides voting.
Right. So that's holding him accountable in November. So based on what you said earlier about you and Van, somebody asked a question, name a substantive policy area or issue where you and Van Jones found strong agreement.
A number. So I'm strongly in favor of gay rights, supportive of gay rights, and have been for 25 years before many elected Democrats were. And so he and I naturally come to that in a very copacetic place. But he and I agree with a lot of the stuff that's going on in the White House, good and bad. He was behind a lot of the criminal justice reform efforts. I supported him through that. He and I agree on a lot when it comes to criminal justice reform. I have long been against capital punishment, which is rare-ish for a conservative. He came to that opinion as well. And so there's a lot of areas of agreement. He started out, I've been covering Syria for as long as it has been going on, unfortunately. And he started out a real, we got to stay out of it kind of guy. And I've convinced him over the many, many years that maybe we should have done a little bit more than we did. And maybe Obama, his former boss, made some mistakes there, something now even Obama admits to. But that dialoguing like that is the only way we get to those points of agreement. And he's pulled me to places, and I've pulled him to places. And I love so much that we trust each other enough, not only to have those conversations, but to have them in public,
Right.
with people watching and other people getting involved. I mean, that's trust. And there are very few people in this business that you form that kind of trust with, where you can sit at the table with them and they're going to be honest brokers. They're going to be respectful. They're going to be generous with space and time and hear your argument and concede points once in a while.
Right.
And so, I mean, he and I are very good friends, not only because he's such a lovely person, but because we have found that trust as two people who really do want to learn from each other. That's where you don't find a lot of those in this business. I'm so grateful for the ones that I have found.
Well, that's the thing, it's funny because I think modeling that idea of communication, real active listening, and being intellectually honest with the person that you're having a discussion with, those are things that should just be common currency for all of us in terms of dealing with our family members, friends, coworkers, et cetera. The questioner asked if we think that we'll ever see that in Washington, D.C.
No. I mean, listen, I'm not trying to virtue signal. I haven't always been, this as open-minded as I am. I came up through right-wing politics. I was unwilling to listen to other sides for a long time. And I found that did me a huge disservice as a journalist. But I think it takes some effort, and it has to be rewarded for it to take hold. And unfortunately, it's not profitable in Washington. Comedy, and concession and compromise is not profitable in Washington right now. There have been times where it's been a virtue, but right now, leaving problems unsolved means you can run on them, and it means you can fundraise on them. If you solve them, immigration, for example, well, if you solve immigration, Democrats can't run on the xenophobic Republicans can't run on the,
overly permissive
asylum, right. Democrats, you can't run on fear and anxiety if you solve problems. And that's such a broken system of government. It's something I spent a lot of time trying to think on and write on, talk to other people about, is how this two-party system and the reward for keeping government broken is deeply underserving American voters. And when you poll American voters, a majority are not satisfied with the two-party system. So why are we just letting it sit there without maybe thinking outside the box a little bit to see if we can do this differently, and actually have a government that governs, that solves problems?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to wrap with a take on a final question that we got. Are you ever concerned about the health and sustainability of media, right, in the kind of landscape that we find ourselves in, right now? Are you ever concerned that kind of free, independent journalism would go away?
All the time, because it's under attack, and not just from nobody, but from the President of the United States is undermining the institution of a free and fair press. He does it all the time, and it's working. It is working. People are not believing us, and some of that is our fault. Some of that is because of our biases and our double standards and mistakes that we make. But a lot of that is being stoked by the president. And other politicians have done it before. He's not the first to do it. It's happened on the left. It's happened on the right. Again, not both sidesing. I'm just saying he didn't invent this.
Right. Historically, this has been a thing. Demonizing the messenger
Sure,
is not new.
exactly. But not to the extent that Trump does it on a daily basis, and he does it about little things, which is so much more nefarious, because it really does undermine the stability of our institution. Now, do I think we're going to survive it? Yes. But it's a challenge to rebuild trust, to regain trust. A lot of that burden is on us because we make mistakes, unforced and, intentional sometimes. But I worry all the time that trust in media is going to have very, very dangerous consequences. And I think that is in evidence right now.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thankful that you are somebody that we can trust to at least shoot straight and tell us like it is. And thank you for doing that for this conversation. Well, we all have our days.
Right.
But I appreciate your candor. I appreciate you coming on and giving us a little bit piece of your wisdom and sharing some of your experiences. Thank you so much for being with us. And hopefully we'll be able to get you back sometime.
Oh, I would love that, Jay. And thanks for putting these together. I think it's great for people like me, but also hopefully for your students and your community to engage on some of these issues. I'm really glad that you did this, and I'm honored that you invited me. Thank you.
Outstanding. Everyone, we're going to close the session now. Obviously, you're more than welcome to respond to us via email and Twitter and all that other good stuff. But thank you for joining us. Thank you again, S.E. Cupp, for sharing your wisdom. Everybody have a great day.